Hey, beautiful soul. Welcome to Spirit Speakeasy. I'm Joy Giovanni, Joyful Medium. I'm a working psychic medium, energy healer, and spiritual gifts mentor. This podcast is like a seat at the table in a secret club, but with mediums, mystics, and the spiritual luminaries of our time. So come behind the velvet ropes with me and see inside my world as I chat insider style with profoundly gifted souls. We go deep, share juicy stories, laugh a lot, and it wouldn't be a speakeasy without great insider secrets and tips. You might even learn that you have some gifts of your own. So step inside the Spirit Speakeasy. Hey, beautiful soul. Welcome back to another episode of Spirit Speakeasy. If you are a new listener, I'm so happy to have you with us in the Spirit Speakeasy today. And if you're a returning listener, of course, welcome back. This is a really exciting topic that we're going to dive into today. We're going to talk about something known as the thinning of the veil. We're going to get into not only what that means, but we're going to explore what it means and how it presents across different cultures and traditions. Now, why are we doing that? A couple reasons. One, very early on when I first decided to try to write a blog and do an accompanying video, one of the first topics that I discussed was the thinning of the veil. I just did a really quick, it was like how you know if you're experiencing the thinning of the veil, something like that. And it still continues to be downloaded and viewed several years later. So I thought, okay, that was just a quick exploration. Let's do a really deep dive. And then I realized, well, to truly understand where this idea of the thinning of the veil comes from, it's fair to look at different regions, different cultures, because where does this idea come from? I also wanted to explore things like, does it have to be assigned to a certain period of the year? And if so, what time of year is the veil the thinnest? Is that true? Does that hold true across different cultures? What are the different beliefs around the world? How do they overlap? Like, where are the similarities and where are the differences? So I'm really excited to deep dive this with you guys today. And then towards the end, we're going to talk about ways that you can experience the thinning of the veil for yourself based on all the information that we go through today. We're also going to explore not only different cultures and beliefs around the thinning of the veil, but how different places can be considered thinner veils. So let's first talk about what the thinning of the veil means. Oh, I wanted to give a little bit of a disclaimer. Of course, I'm not going to be able to mention every culture, every region, every group, but we go into several. And I just want to make it understood that my intention is to hold these ideals in the highest respect, whether you agree with these beliefs or not, whether you agree with some of them and not others. It's my intention to really explore and express this information with the greatest reverence and respect for everyone's beliefs. I do try to err on the side of cultural belief rather than religious belief, because I think to dive into the religion of it all is just a whole nother thing. And it's really not what we do here. So I'm erring more on the cultural side than on the religious side, but there are some places where that overlaps a little bit. So if I get anything wrong, even though I've done quite a bit of research, feel free to correct me, but please accept my apology in advance. And again, I'm really meaning to do this with the highest respect. That being said, I've done a ton of research. So in the show notes, whether you're listening to this as a podcast on any of the platforms or whether you're watching it on YouTube or on my website, joyfulmedium.com, in the blog section, I will have a ton of websites listed in the show notes in case you want to do some more digging and diving for yourself. So that being said, let's dive in. What the thinning of the veil is actually talking about is this idea. The veil itself is indicative of the reason why, or the energy explanation of why we are not constantly aware of the spirit world. It's this idea that there's a valence, an energetic valence that separates this side and the other side, the physical life and the afterlife, so to speak. And in certain cultures and certain beliefs, and certainly in pop culture in the US, we have this idea that around Halloween, around spooky season, that veil, that etheric layer that separates the physical world and the non-physical world, or the our human world and the spirit world, that this valence gets thinner and we can see and feel spirit more during certain times of year or during certain practices. So that's the general idea of what this veil is. It's veil like veil, like a wedding veil. So something that's covering our sight or our awareness, to not be aware of spirit, guides, angels in physical form all the time. So that's essentially the idea of what the veil is. So then the thinning of the veil, of course, would mean that this veil, this etheric energy between the living and the other side, the spirit side, is thinner, is more permeable, is moving more into our awareness. In some of these cultures, you'll see that it's a time when there's kind of commingling with the living and the dead. So that's in a nutshell what the veil is. I think most of us sort of understand the general idea of what this valence is. But I really want to explore what different cultures believe about this, because I think you might be really surprised how many cultural beliefs perhaps you've taken on from various cultures that maybe you don't even know why that's why you believe that, or that's why you celebrate that. So I'm going to go through some of these in no particular order. I, as many of you know, live in Southern California. I'm in San Diego, which is very close to the border of Mexico. So a lot of Southern California culture kind of intermingles with Mexican folklore and culture. That is the group, or the culture, the region, the tradition that I'm going to start with is Mexican folklore. And in Mexican folklore, they have something called Dia de los Muertos, which is the Day of the Dead. This is celebrated typically from October 31st to November 2nd. And what this belief is around this thinning of the veil is that essentially the veil between the living and the dead is thin during this time, which allows the spirits of deceased loved ones to visit the world of the living. And offerings are given to help guide the spirits back. So the Dia de los Muertos, again, it's October 31st to November 2nd. Historically, it has its origins in the indigenous traditions and goes all the way back to the Aztecs and other indigenous peoples of Mexico, who had not just a few days of this, like I said, October 31st to November 2nd, but they celebrated it as an entire month originally dedicated to the dead. And it originally coincided with what was an Aztec holy month, which roughly corresponds to like late July and early August. So that was where that tradition originated. But after the Spanish colonization of Mexico, it became intertwined with Catholicism, and it was adapted to the current timing, to this October 31st to November 2nd, to align with what is known in Catholicism as All Saints' Day, which is November 1st, or All Souls' Day, which is November 2nd. I want to talk a little bit about the traditions and customs of Dia de los Muertos. One of the things that is done traditionally are altars. So families or loved ones create these beautiful, colorful altar spaces in their homes, usually, to honor their deceased loved ones. And these altars are adorned with things like candies and foods that the loved ones would have loved, and photographs and candles and flowers, usually marigolds, or those orange gold flowers. You'll see those. And they also do something called sugar skulls. If you haven't seen those, they are often made out of candy or have colorful icing, and have the names of the deceased on them. But sugar skulls we also know as the beautiful skulls that are painted decoratively with all the bright colors. You could Google that really easily if you wanted to see some images of the sugar skulls. They're really beautiful, but they are considered an offering and decorative elements that symbolize the sweetness of life. And there's also something that they call pan de muerto, which is pan is bread. It's a special bread, and it's baked and offered at the altar that the family's created. And it's often decorated with bone-shaped pieces of dough and dusted with sugar. And again, representing the sweetness of life and the nourishment, and an offering of love to exchange. So families often also, as a part of this celebration, will visit the cemeteries, they'll clean, they'll decorate, and sometimes they'll have celebrations for the loved ones. It's a community experience. So it could be several family members getting together, but it's also representative of celebrations done within the community as a whole. For those of you that have ever been to Southern California or to Mexico during this time, it is really celebratory. And actually, you can often see some of the sugar skulls or items that would go on an altar kind of all year long, but it's really concentrated in this October 31st to November 2nd time period. So it's really a celebration, and cemeteries come alive with music and remembrances. And it's thought that, again, during this time, the veil is thin, and those that have crossed over, the deceased loved ones, are visiting, their souls are visiting, and they're celebrating with the loved ones here. So in that custom, in the Dia de los Muertos, it is thought that the veil is the thinnest from October 31st to November 2nd. But remember, originally it was July and August. I want to move slightly. There's a lot of these that we're going to go through. So I want to move slightly to Italian folklore and the thinning of the veil. Many of you might know that I'm Italian, so that is one of the reasons I'm bringing that up here. Something to know about the Italian folklore around this veil thinning is that it really is a complex tapestry of regions and beliefs and practices. So it can really widely vary depending on the region of Italy that someone is from, the north, the south, etc. The thinning of the veil and the interactions with supernatural creatures are really an integral aspect of the folklore of Italy, often tied to specific dates, lunar phases, and rituals that are deeply ingrained in specific local traditions. So there's a lot of variance in Italy itself, but the timing for the Italian folklore, they really have this rich tradition and belief related to the thinning of the veil and supernatural creatures. While these traditions can vary by region, some of the things that are often in common have to do with timing. So the lunar phase is what I want to talk about here. It's believed that these supernatural creatures, such as witches, or we call them strega, are more active during certain lunar phases, particularly on nights of the full moon. So this is one of the places that these beliefs come from, but you'll see there's many places. So these nights are often associated with heightened mystical activity, and I think many of you listening will have heard of this idea of heightened mystical activity around the full moon. Now, of course, Italian culture and folklore is not the only tradition that has this, but it's certainly present here. So again, associated with the full moon, really heightened mystical activity, and they're considered times when the veil between the natural and the supernatural world is thinner. There are some specific dates and festivals that are on the traditional Italian calendar that are associated with kind of supernatural occurrences. For example, there's something called the Strega Nonna Festival. It's really the Feast of the Epiphany, but Strega Nonna is like this little old Italian grandma witch. And in the tradition, essentially she's La Befana, which is pretty much a witch. And she's basically like the OG Santa Claus. So it's a time when rituals such as like blessings of the homes and making offerings are performed to ward off negative influences and seek protection. It's usually celebrated January 5th or 6th. This festival in some regions honors the character, like I was saying, this Strega Nonna in Italian folklore, La Befana. And she's got the broom and the whole thing. So that is one time when the veil is believed to be thinner. And really in the tradition and the folklore, Strega Nona La Befana comes in and bestows gifts to the children in the night, like an OG Santa Claus. But there's also blessings and protection as part of it. Another thing in Italian folklore is the Feast of San Giovanni. It's St. John's Eve. It's celebrated the night of June 23rd and into the 24th. And this is a time when bonfires are lit to celebrate summer solstice. I just want to kind of like highlight here, you'll see this kind of throughout this pinging back and forth between the fall harvest and the summer solstice in a lot of these traditions. So just be aware of that as we keep moving through. So they light these bonfires, they're celebrating the solstice. And in some regions, it's believed that this night is particularly magical, and lots of rituals and festivals take place to receive blessings, to ward off spirits that would be considered, unwanted. So that really is the timing and the belief of the Italian folklore around this thinning of the veil. I want to bring us a little bit closer to home and look at the traditions in somewhere like New Orleans. Now, those of you that have been longtime listeners of the podcast know that I did a trip to New Orleans in the spring of 2023. And if you check out I think it is episode 22, Why Some Places Feel More Haunted. I shared about some of this with my trip to New Orleans, but I really just want to highlight that New Orleans is this blend of hoodoo and voodoo and African folklore and culture of the West Indies and the Caribbean. So it really is a very special melting pot in the New Orleans area, plus the local traditions and the Cajun traditions and the Creole traditions kind of all mixed together. So the timing and practices in New Orleans can be observed really throughout the year, but there are specific rituals and celebrations related to the thinning of the veil and honoring of the dead. They also do altars and ancestor veneration, ancestor respect and offerings. Hoodoo practitioners often set up altars to honor their ancestors and to connect with their spirits. And these altars may include things like photographs, offerings of food, candles, spiritual items. Sound familiar? These practices of ancestor veneration and adoration is a way to maintain that connection with the souls or the spirits of the deceased loved ones. And they also celebrate All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. Similar to those Catholic traditions, some practitioners of voodoo and hoodoo in New Orleans also observe All Saints' Day, which is November 1st, and All Souls' Day, which is November 2nd, as a time to honor and remember the dead. They do something called the Feast of the Dead, and this can involve things like preparing special meals and offerings to honor crossed over loved ones. And similar to the Mexican tradition, families may also gather at grave sites in local cemeteries to share food and stories and remembrances of their loved ones. Some people do rituals to facilitate communication and seek guidance from their deceased ancestors. So they do have a special time period around November 1st and 2nd, but in New Orleans and in the hoodoo, voodoo, African folklore, West Indies, Caribbean, Creole culture, this is also typically done throughout the year. These altars and ancestral veneration is the best way to say it. Now, let's shift over to exploring South Indian culture because there's a lot to offer there too. They celebrate something called Pitru Paksha. In South Indian and Hindu traditions, Pitru Paksha is a 16-day period dedicated to honoring and appeasing deceased ancestors. It typically falls in September or October during the waning moon phase. So waxing moon is when the moon is getting bigger to full. Waning is when it is getting smaller. So in the Hindu tradition, it's believed that Pitru Paksha is when the gates of the afterlife are opened, allowing souls of deceased ancestors to visit the earthly realms. Again, are you seeing some similarities here in some of these traditions and beliefs? These ancestral spirits during Pitru Paksha are believed to be in a restless state or journeying, and they are given offerings and prayers to help find peace and progress on their spiritual journey. Also, charity and donation are a big part of this celebration, giving to the needy, making charitable donations. This is also really encouraged during Pitru Paksha. It's believed that performing acts of charity in the name of your ancestors, so, it could be longer back ancestors or someone that's crossed over, you're going to do like a good deed or a donation in their name, can generate positive karma and really benefit the deceased souls. They also do something called Tarpana, which is the central ritual of Pitru Paksha, and it is when family members, especially the eldest son or the designated priest or holy person, perform rituals during this 6-day period. Involves the offerings of water and other specific items such as like sesame seeds, rice, black sesame to the ancestors. And it's believed that these offerings nourish and satisfy their souls or the spirits of the deceased. Shraddha is a ceremony on specific days during Pitru Paksha, and it's a more elaborate ritual. The Shraddha is, I want to make sure I'm saying that right, Shraddha. The ceremony is performed, like I said, during specific days, and the ceremony involves offering cooked foods and fruits and sweets and other items to the ancestors. And the food is usually placed beautifully in banana leaves. Prayers are recited. The ritual is considered an act of gratitude and respect to the ancestors, the forefathers, and the deceased loved ones. So I thought it was really cool how even so far away in the world, some of these traditions have these beautiful overlapping threads of belief. And I want to move on to this idea of Chinese Ghost Month. I thought this was also really beautiful. This is between August 12th and September 14th. And in Chinese culture, the 7th month of the lunar calendar is known as Ghost Month. So you see, some of these are around certain time periods as far as like harvest or solstice, but this is a little different because this has to do with the lunar calendar. It's also believed that during this time, the gates of the afterlife are open and deceased ancestors and spirits, the way it was in my research, like lost or wandering spirits return to the earthly realms, and people offer food and incense and prayers to honor and nourish and appease these spirits and ancestors. And on the 15th day of the month, there is something known as the Ghost Festival, or the Festival of the Hungry Ghost. And it is observed like as a significant special day for honoring the loved ones. And again, it is this time when the veil is thin, the gates of the afterlife are opened, and deceased loved ones are visiting the earthly realms. So I thought the timing of it's interesting because it's lunar calendar, so it's not necessarily around a harvest, but it is kind of close, pushing into that harvest time. So I also want to touch into some indigenous theories and traditions. I do want to mention that with most in Native American indigenous traditions, there is a level of privacy and respect. So I'm just going to touch in to the Hopi indigenous American traditions. Now, the Hopis believe that the spirits of their ancestors or the spirits of those that have crossed over leave their homes in the mountains for 6 months to visit the tribe, bringing health to the Hopi and rain to the crops. And the arrival of these spirits is celebrated in January or February. The thinning of the veil belief that they have is that at death, the Hopi believe that the soul leaves the body through the mouth and continues to exist in another world. And this belief is manifested again and again in different ceremonies. And there are many ceremonies throughout the year for the Hopi people, but 9 ceremonies unfold the entire course of what is called the Hopi Road to Life. The Hopi Nation have something called Kachina dances, which is every month during this time except June. In July, precisely at midsummer for the Hopi, the Niman ceremony is held. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. I did look up pronunciation for a lot of these terms that I wasn't familiar with, but I could not find any oral pronunciation for this. So it's Niman. It's a ceremony that is held. It is the going away of the gods or the going home ceremony, marking the ending ceremony of the season of the souls. Since the winter solstice, all the spirits, all the souls and beings have been on earth for the sacred ceremonies. It's time for them to return to their spiritual home. So this is a longer period of thinning of the veil, visiting with the loved ones, respect, celebration, veneration. So this going home ceremony really is marking the ending of the season of the souls. And again, they've been having these ceremonies since winter solstice, and it's over this 9-month period. So the ceremony involves intense prayer for the entire village, and the energy, the hope for peace is sent out to all mankind. So this is really a beautiful part of the way that the Hopi understand this idea of crossed over loved ones or loved ones who've left a physical body and ancestors. The spirit beings on earth have been there for all of the sacred ceremonies, and during this ending period in July, precisely at midsummer in the Hopi tradition, it's time for them to return to their spiritual home. And I think it is so amazing that not only are they honoring, communicating, having that exchange with their spiritual loved ones, but they're also sending out the entire village this energy, hope, and peace for all mankind. I thought that was really beautiful. Something really fascinating that I came across in my research is this mention that the Hopi were the only tribe to escape Spanish rule in 1695 during the Spanish missionary colonization, because their land was very remote. And so their practices and ceremonies are completely independent from that Catholicism and that Christian influence that you see kind of intertwined with a lot of these traditions. So I thought that was a really incredible idea and tradition around this thinning of the veil and communicating with crossed over loved ones. We're going to go through a few more. I am really revere the Maori traditions. So that is the indigenous people of New Zealand. And with the Maori people, they have traditions. They have a celebration called Matariki, which connects the appearance of the star cluster, which is Pleiades, as in the way that we know it, in the winter sky. And this is when the Maori New Year happens. It is in June or July each year. And the thinning of the veil, the Maori honor their ancestors and the celestial beings, believing that the cluster's appearance, the Pleiades in the sky, the astrological cluster, the appearance signals a time when the veil between the living and the spiritual world is thinner, allowing for ancestral connections and reflection and exchange of love. So I think it's fascinating that this is happening in June or July, but it's also where we're seeing it being around an astrological event, the Pleiades in the winter sky in New Zealand. So that is how the Maori people in New Zealand understand the thinning of the veil. And I just thought that the timing and the significance was very interesting. Now, in Yoruba culture and religion, there isn't a specific day or time period that's universally considered to be when the veil between the physical and spiritual realm is thinner. However, certain rituals and festivals and ceremonies are believed to facilitate stronger connection between the living and the spiritual world. So I'm going to give a few examples. Yoruba culture and religion is prevalent in Africa, specifically in Nigeria and other areas, but there are many people across the world that practice both the Yoruba tradition, the culture, and the religion. It's both a culture and a religion. So many Yoruba families maintain ancestral shrines within their home. Offerings, prayers, and rituals are conducted at these shrines or with these shrines to maintain a connection with the crossed over ancestors or the deceased ancestors. It's believed that the ancestral spirits can offer protection, guidance, and blessings to the living. And in Yoruba culture, it's common for people to make direct contact with their ancestral spirits. The most prevalent method of communication is often through dreams, and information can come through participation in annual ancestor festivals. In Yoruba culture and religion, it's the concept that the veil between the physical and the spiritual worlds is intertwined with their daily life, rituals, ceremonies, prayers, rites that they complete. So rather than being set aside for a specific period of the year or specific dates or specific phase within the lunar calendar, for example, like some of the others we've talked about in Yoruba culture and religion, it really is intertwined in daily life and ritual and ceremony, this connection with ancestors and loved ones that have crossed over. So this made me curious about what this looked like in ancient Egypt. So we all know that ancient Egyptians are famous for their pyramids and tombs and temples, and that the ancient Egyptians believed in an afterlife. But did you know that to communicate with loved ones in the beyond, they wrote what are called letters to the dead? These letters sometimes asked for things like advice or blessings or intercession of some kind. And it was believed that the answers or responses to these letters would be received through either signs or dreams, or sometimes messages through a seer, which is sort of like a psychic. And sometimes were the resolution to the problem would just show up. So sometimes like the problem would just resolve itself, or the solution would make itself clear. But sometimes they'd receive guidance through signs and dreams. I thought that was really profound. Writing to the dead seems like it was no different than writing to someone in another city on Earth. And there seems to be almost no difference in the way that the two types of letters would be written, according to worldhistory.org and archaeologists and historians. So while the rituals and offerings were part of their regular practices, it doesn't seem to be associated to a particular season or any time of the year that was like favorable for these letters to the dead, and seemed to be more of an ongoing practice. So I think it's so interesting how there's this, seems to be this divide between groups that celebrate this thinning of the veil or connection to loved ones at a specific time period in the year versus this all year, anytime, based on specific practices philosophy. Now, this brings us to Celtic paganism, which celebrates something called Samhain. And this is where traditions get really blended. So first I'm going to talk about Samhain, and then I'm going to move on and talk about Halloween, because these are very closely tied together. So in Celtic paganism, Samhain, which is often written as and pronounced as Samhain. It's Samhain, but it's actually pronounced Samhain. This is celebrated on October 31st to November 1st. And it is believed that during Samhain, the veil between the physical world and the spiritual world is thinner due to the transition from the lighter half of the year, summer, to the darker half of the year, winter. So this is around a harvest time, but it's also to do with the solstice. Today, the beliefs of Samhain are still recognized across the world. Many modern pagans and Wiccans and other spiritual groups celebrate the fire festival. Traditions include bonfires and music and feasting and dancing. Some still make food and offerings for the dead, along with offerings of sweets and ales. And this belief has translated into pop culture in the US and other countries, along with Halloween, also referred to as All Hallows Eve. So in Celtic paganism, it is this time when we're shifting from the lighter half of the year to the darker half of the year, but it is marked with this fire festival and celebration, similar to what we've seen in some of the other traditions. And it is thought that the veil is thinner during that time. So that brings us to the idea that many of us have grown up with Halloween. I was really curious, where did Halloween come from? And I learned that in the 8th century, it was actually Pope Gregory III that designated November 1st as a time to honor the saints. So that's what we've heard about in some of these traditions already, this idea of All Saints' Day. So soon after that, All Saints' Day came to incorporate some of the traditions of Samhain. So it's almost like the Pope decides this day is going to be, All Saints' Day. And then soon after that, a lot of the traditions of Samhain that we were just discussing become incorporated into this idea of All Saints Day. The evening before All Saints Day was known as All Hallows Eve and later Halloween. So it really is the eve of the Saints Day, All Hallows Eve, Halloween. And this idea of seeing ghosts around Halloween, the festival of Samhain marked the transition to the new year at the end of the harvest and the beginning of winter. So, I mean, I know that now we do our new year at a different time, but back in the day, it was all about the harvest, as many of you know. So at the end of harvest, at the beginning of winter, there was this new year, and the Celtic people believed that during the festival, that spirits walked the earth. And later on, Catholic and Christian missionaries introduced this All Souls Day, which is November 2nd, which perpetuated the idea of the living coming into contact with the dead around the same time of year. So you can see how there's all these interesting threads and connections and similarities, even though groups and beliefs are really widespread. So that is really the origin story of Halloween and how this idea of this thinning of the veil is shown in different cultures. But now I want to touch into this idea of spiritualism and New Age and seance and all that. So in spiritualism, it's not necessarily spiritualist. That's a religion. That's a different thing and not exactly what we're talking about, but spiritualism and seance. Spiritualism and seance can be conducted at any time of the year, but really gained popularity in the 19th and 20th century. And people that practice seance believe that during seances, the veil between the living and the spirit world would thin, allowing mediums to communicate with the deceased. And this is done lots of different ways. Sometimes it is just about calling the energy or the souls of the loved ones or the spirit people into the room and having them create sound or noise or this. It almost looks like a fog when you see it in a space during a seance, but it is also channeling communication, which is sometimes what we do here with the Violet Flame Collective, but it really can be done any time of year. It is more about that it's this collective coming together at any time with the intention and through using the energy of a medium that this communication can happen with the deceased or with the other side. So really this thinning of the veil is not tied to a specific time of year with seance. Now, in the New Age belief and occult belief, I don't necessarily love these words, but this is the heading I have to put it under because this is how it's really understood. New Age, right? And occult beliefs. I guess I would be under the New Age blanket maybe as a medium and as a psychic and channel and all the things. In New Age beliefs and occult beliefs, timing is not necessarily tied to a specific date for the thinning of the veil, but really can occur based on practices and meditation. And it's more of a moving your awareness to become aware of the spirit side, aware of your loved ones, aware of light beings or angels or guides around you, and not necessarily tied to a specific time period in the year, tied to a specific date. It's really believed by myself and lots of other practitioners that we're really seeking to connect with light beings, spiritual forces, I guess, during meditation. And we can use a variety of like different tools and different exercises to access the spiritual realms. But we don't necessarily need a specific date for this veil to be thinner. I'm going to talk more about this, but sometimes energy can be built up in a specific place over a long period of time that then it feels like the veil is thinner in that place. Like I said, we're going to dive into that in a minute. But in the belief of mediumship, at least evidential mediumship in the way I train and practice, and many of my colleagues and friends, it is more about the consistent practice of being in meditation and spending time with the spirit world. Because again, I've mentioned this before, but the other side, the spirit side, really is a world within our world. So it is all around us. It's just the unseen world, hence the veil. But we don't necessarily, or I don't necessarily believe that it has to be only tied to a specific time period, like if you don't get that November 1st day, you're out of luck, I believe we can connect, communicate, exchange information, love, emotion with our ancestors and loved ones on the other side at any time. That really the veil can be, oh, this is like getting into a literal sense of a veil, I guess. The veil can be lifted by just moving your awareness to the spirit world, to the memory of your loved one who's on the other side. So I hope that makes sense about how it's a little bit different. It is often better achieved through like a regular practice of it, just so you get comfortable with it, so you kind of know, you're setting aside that time to meditate and to spend time with your loved one, for example, if that's your goal, or time with the spirit world if you're looking for larger communication, or if you're looking to feel more of the essence of the spirit world. I do think we get hung up on a little bit of like the spooky season traditions. And I have some thoughts about that I'm going to share in just a minute. But I think we would be missing something if we didn't talk about these next couple topics. So what about astrological theories and traditions? Because you see, some of the groups that we mentioned or touched into are not necessarily following just a calendar, but they're following a harvest, they're following a solstice, they're following a lunar phase. So what is the astrological theory and tradition around this thinning of the veil? So astrological theories are not necessarily tied to specific dates, but may be influenced with celestial events or by celestial events. So some astrologers believe that certain planetary alignments or like celestial events can create periods where the veil between the dimensions is thinner or feels thinner, potentially facilitating more spiritual experiences or insights. So I'm going to give you some examples. Something like solar and lunar eclipses fall under this category. Eclipses are considered powerful moments when the sun, the moon, and the earth align in unique ways, like not an everyday occurrence, but only specific times. And some astrologers believe that eclipses can open energetic portals, energetic availability to deeper spiritual insights or transformations. It's why sometimes people are timing their spiritual work or their beliefs around certain astrological events. Something like Mercury retrograde, for example. Mercury retrograde periods are often associated with communication. I know we often think of them as like challenges and disruptions with communication, but some people see them and use them, these Mercury retrogrades, as time when introspection and inner exploration can lead to profound insights and profound connections with higher realms, the other side, so to speak. And one other thing I want to mention is this idea of equinox periods or solstice periods, because again, we saw that in several of the traditions and beliefs. So equinox and solstice periods, these celestial events, are believed to have profound impact on personal and collective consciousness, potentially making it easier to access spiritual realms or gain insights into the mysteries of the universe, according to astrological traditions. I do think it's really interesting that a lot of the beliefs around this thinning of the veil do happen to be around these times of solstice and equinox. So it's really interesting how all of these things work together, even when we don't necessarily know that that's part of this belief system or part of the tradition around it. The other thing that I feel is really significant that I think is missed a lot is this idea of geographic locations. Now, what do I mean by that? Their beliefs about the thinning of the veil or this boundary between the physical and the spiritual realms being weaker or being more permeable or more easily felt at certain geographic locations. And this is also found in various cultures and traditions like across the world. So these beliefs often have cultural, historical, and mythological reasons, stories associated with them, with these specific places. But I'm going to give you some examples. So something like a sacred site. Many sacred sites or holy sites are believed to be in locations where the veil between earthly and spiritual realms is thin. And these sites are often like associated with divine mystical events or miracles or the presence of a revered figure or a religious figure. So it would be something like Mount Sinai in Egypt. There's Mount Kailash in Tibet, Mount Shasta in California, certain sacred mountain formations in the US. If you remember in episode 24, Ghost Stories, when I was having visitations from the spirit woman in the house that I used to live at, she was showing me certain mountain formations as being sacred places where it was thought that this veil was thinner or that this communication could be different. So sacred sites, there are thousands of them all over the world. And, some of these sacred sites are really controversial when we look at somewhere like Israel, for example. There are a lot of sacred sites that many different groups believe are sacred. Is there more potential for this communion or communication with the other side at these sacred sites? Is the veil thinner? Is the ability to connect heightened because of all the concentrated energy there? I believe often it is. Now, what about something like natural phenomena? Geographic locations where there's certain like unusual or explained natural phenomena. These places can also be seen as places where the veils are thin. So, for example, something like Sedona in Arizona, where it's known for its vortices, or some people say vortexes, but vortices is plural of vortex. So, these energetic areas, or where there's a pull energetically, that some people believe that these energy centers facilitate spiritual experiences and connections. If you have had an experience like that, I would love to hear about it. Make sure you write in. This can also be somewhere like Stonehenge, for example, where there is phenomena that is believed to happen there. We're going to get into that in a minute. Something else to consider under this geographical locations heading is historical events. So places where significant historical events or battles or tragedies have occurred. We may believe, or some may believe, the veil to be thinner in these places. The belief that the energy or the emotions associated with these events linger. So energy can be built up in a place and can be sensed or interacted with. Some examples include things like battlefields or like haunted hotels, ancient ruins, sites of natural disaster. Again, episode 22, why some places feel more haunted. We talk about this. So if you want to go back and check out that episode and really have a deep dive understanding of why some places do feel more haunted or like the veil is thinner, emotions and energy can build up over time in a place. This brings me to this idea of mystical landscapes. So certain landscapes, such as like forests or mountains or caves or certain bodies of water, can sometimes be associated with the veil being thinner due to not only natural beauty, but solitude, connection with higher power or universal energy, and can be perceived to have more spiritual significance. It's why some people feel more closely connected to the universe or their loved ones on the other side when they're at the beach or when they're in a beautiful forest, for example. These places are believed to facilitate deep meditative experiences and the ability to connect with the divine or higher energy. Cultural and mythologic connections. I also want to talk about cultural myths and stories that may attribute to thin veils in specific locations. For example, in Celtic mythology, I know we talked a lot about Samhain. In Celtic mythology, there are what they refer to as quote unquote thin places where the mortal world and the other world are believed to intersect, often associated with ancient stones, stone circles, burial mounds. I can't think of the name of it right now, but there is a show that everyone was crazy about in the last few years where she went to this particular stone circle and she was taken back in time and lived a whole nother life in this whole other world because of this mythical stone formation. That would be something like Stonehenge or crop circles, things like that. So these thin places are places where it is believed that the connection or that veil is much thinner. Also, in a lot of practices and beliefs, crossroads are considered a place where the veil is thinner. And what does that mean, crossroads? Literally, where two paths meet. So it could be an intersection, it could be anywhere where two paths meet, a crossroads, like an old school literal crossroads. They're sometimes seen as places where the veil is thin. In like folklore and mythology and certain pagan practices, crossroads are associated with choices and decisions, and they may be linked to encounters or experiences with spirits or souls or what some people might call supernatural beings. Crossroads are often considered sacred places. And, even in our own lives, we use the term crossroads when we kind of are at almost a sacred decision making place in our own path. So, crossroads can be seen as somewhere where the veil between worlds is thinner. Now, I also want to highlight that places like spiritual retreats and monasteries, for example, can also be considered places where this veil is thinner or where the energy is built up over time to where communication is more easily facilitated. So think of like isolated, remote monasteries, temples, spiritual retreats in remote areas that are often chosen for their specific perceived connection to the spiritual realm. And these locations offer not only like tranquility and solitude, but they're really conducive to meditation and spiritual practices. And it can often be more about the collective group energy, like the group that is coming there over and over to pray or meet or meditate for a purpose. And it raises the vibration over time. It can sometimes be that more so than like the sacred nature of the place itself, but certainly it can be both of those things together, depending on the place. It's important to note that all of these beliefs vary widely across cultures and regions, and what's considered a thin place or spiritually charged place in one culture may not hold the same significance at all in another culture. And also, these beliefs are often rooted in folklore and mythology and cultural traditions rather than like hard data and evidence. And they serve to enhance the sense of the sacred and the mystical and the connection in certain geographic locations. The one example I could give right now of that is how I was mentioning in that episode, I think it was 22, or maybe it was 24, 24, where the woman was visiting me in my home, and she was showing me these different types of mountains in the region and how they were sacred for different reasons. Well, another culture or another group might not realize these specific peaks and hills as sacred, but in the Kumeyaay tradition, they did. So sometimes it depends on your perspective, I guess. And I want to give you some final thoughts and talk about how you can harness all of these different traditions and ideas and beliefs around the thinning of the veil for your own communication and exploration. So, some final thoughts for you. I know that was a lot of information to digest. I do love the through threads and how you can see that, yes, there's lots of different ways to use the timing, to use the astrological events, to use cultures and traditional beliefs from different regions, from different groups, sacred locations, energy built up over time, or even just your own practice. There's not necessarily one way to experience this thinning of the veil. I do want to say, if you're someone who has the privilege of knowing your personal history or like your family history or genealogy, or have the privilege of accessing that information, you could consider exploring the traditions of the different groups and people that you are born from to see what traditions are in your lineage, in your past. And if you don't know, if you don't have the privilege of knowing your genealogy, for example, you could explore the traditions and cultures and beliefs in the geographic place where you currently live. Like who used to live there? What did they believe? What astrology or astrological historical events did they use to harness, this thinning of the etheric veil? The other thing to consider is that you can create sacred space and set intentions anywhere that you are. So maybe for you, it is doing a formal shelf or altar space to honor and respect and spend time with your crossed over loved one. But maybe it's you setting sacred space and setting those intentions wherever you are. I know some mediumship readers, for example, who have a candle, and anytime that they light that candle, that is their indication that they are creating that area around them as a sacred space and setting the intention to spend time with the spirit world. So they could just take that candle everywhere they go if they travel, for example. It's really more about, for me, in my belief, it's really more about where you're placing your attention and your intentions. So if you're placing your attention and moving it to the memory of your loved one in the spirit world and carving out time to sit even 5 or 10 minutes with the intention of spending time with their soul, you are thinning the veil yourself. It's really about the intention and, like I said, where you're placing your intention. But I would really suggest seeing which practices or rituals work for you personally. I've talked about this before, but we all experience, receive, understand, communicate with spirit differently. For some people, they may receive a visitation from a loved one in a dream, but someone else, that loved one might show up in a sign for them, or might put music across their path, or might just, you might sense or feel, or they might pop into your mind over your shoulder while you're doing dishes or doing gardening. So I think it's great to harness this idea of the thinning of the veil, depending on whenever you believe that it is. Again, there's a lot of through thread of common belief around that theme of Samhain, right? Or of Dia de los Muertos, or the All Saints Day and All Souls Day, where it kind of is that harvest time, that late October to early November time period. And the other thing is, again, remember, concentration of focus or energy or belief can create that energy or that movement. So with Dia de los Muertos, for example, tens of thousands and probably millions of people during those days are focusing on that type of intention, that type of awareness, that type of ancestral celebration and honoring. So is the energy built and raised during that time period? There's a strong potential then it is. Like, to me, it makes sense that it would be, because it's many souls on this side centering their attention and their energy and their awareness around their loved ones and honoring them and feeling them and sensing them. But that doesn't mean, for me anyway, in my belief system and in my work as a medium, it doesn't mean that we can't also do that on other days. So for me, it's more about the intention and the personal practice that you have, whether it's sitting in meditation a few days a week for 10 minutes to spend time with your loved one. Like I said, whether it's having an altar space or a photo or an item that you wear of that loved one to keep them close to you. There is a lot of ways to experience this thinning of the veil. But I really wanted to give you a good overview of the way many other groups and cultures and traditions experience this, believe this, explore this. So you can just really have a full gamut of potential and possibility for how you might engage in this exploration of the non-physical world, the spirit world, right, in your life. I'm so curious to know which of these resonated with you. I'm curious if you were surprised that this idea of Halloween came directly from this idea of Samhain and this spiritual tradition and celebration of Samhain being adopted by this Pope and designated as the days, as the saints' days, and how that really permeated into so many belief systems, but also the similarities and belief systems that have nothing to do with the Crusades and Catholicism, and how that appeared, and the difference of the ancient Aztec tradition of a month-long celebration versus the ancient Egyptian tradition of an ongoing conversation, through writing letters, through their own rituals and versions of ancestral altars and offerings and to deities that they did. So this is really food for thought, I think, no matter whether you feel that the thinning of the veil is tied to spooky season or Halloween or harvest or Samhain, or whether it is Dia de los Muertos for you or All Saints Day, or whether you believe it's astrological events. Maybe it's winter and summer solstice that you feel that veil is thinner and you feel you can more easily sense or connect. I really believe that it's in an everyday practice or whenever you feel like it, access to your loved ones, because truly the spirit world, the non-physical world, exists in our world right now. It's just that we are not aware of them with our five physical senses. We're not seeing them with our physical eyes. We're not touching them with our physical hands, or they're not touching us with physical hands. But it doesn't mean that they're not around you all the time, spending time with you, experiencing you, being with you. I do find it pretty fascinating that it seems like almost every culture, tradition, group, region has some version of a belief of the ability to commune, connect, share with their loved ones in the spirit world. That is really fascinating to me as a medium. And I really just want to encourage you to explore what works for you. It's fair to try on several of these different traditions and practices to see what fits the best for you. But now you know where this idea of the thinning of the veil comes from across the world, how it fits into what you believe, and some ideas and options and things to explore. So let me know what you believe about the thinning of the veil, or if this has opened your eyes or shown you anything new, or even kind of gotten those creative, inspiring juices flowing that now you're going to try something like this. For me personally, I have a daily practice of sitting with the spirit world, building a relationship with the spirit world in general, because I work with other people's loved ones as a medium. But I also have some things I do to honor and spend time with my own loved ones in the spirit world, versions of ancestral altars that I have. They're not exactly the same as they are in perhaps other cultures and traditions and religions, but they're my own version. And that's my last point, is I really do believe that it's okay to try things on, mix and match, and use what works for you. Do your own exploration, see what works the best for you, see when you feel most connected to the spirit world, see the different ways that you feel like you connect. And do you feel like you want to do a big celebration once a year and still also do an ongoing communication throughout the year? There's really not a lot of rules around this, and we are so individual and we go through so many different phases and time periods in our life. So as you grow and change, so too might the way that you feel the thinning of the veil. But just know that whether you sense that the veil is thinner with certain astrological events, or in certain geographic locations, or sacred spaces, or times of the year, just know that your loved ones are available to you, that you do have the ability to access them, and that certainly they feel your love and are sharing their love with you all the time. I'm so curious for your feedback on this episode, so feel free to drop a comment. I would love it if you would subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already. It helps me because you never miss an episode, and it helps you because you never miss an episode. So with all of that being said, I think we've got a lot to consider and practice, but I really just wanted to deep dive with you into the thinning of the veil. Big hugs. Bye for now from inside Spirit Speakeasy.